I'm Afshan Ratansi, and you're watching a very special episode of Going Underground. If coronavirus is a symptom of animal-transmitted pandemics caused by deforestation, the Amazon rainforest is not only the lungs of the Earth, which will determine climate-driven human extinction, but it will decide the future of killer viruses before the Earth burns. One nation holds more rainforest than any other, and today we speak to its former president, jailed for nearly 2 years after an alleged US-backed show trial. After leaving office in 2010, he was later convicted on charges of corruption, which saw him imprisoned for 580 days over the so-called Operation Car Wash, the largest corruption probe in the nation's history that discovered vast contracts for kickbacks involving the ruling elite. His imprisonment arguably catalyzed the election of Jair Bolsonaro as president of Latin America's largest country. Brazil's most popular politician, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, brought tens of millions of his people out of poverty and into education as president. He joins me now from the fourth most populous city in the world, Sao Paulo. Former President Lula, thank you for being on Going Underground. What a journey you've been on. First, why are you accusing your successor, Jair Bolsonaro, of genocide?
For a very simple reason. Our president did not take care of Brazil and of the Brazilian people as he should have done. This pandemic did not reach Brazil without prior notice. We already had the experience of what was going on in other countries around the world, and the president should have simply done the obvious. Only what common sense teaches us to do. The president, since he doesn't know about anything except weapons and violence, should have set up a technical committee with experts and scientists. He should have gathered all state governors as well as mayors and established a crisis committee to guide Brazilian society to participate in the process of mitigating the impacts of the pandemic in Brazil. He did not do this. He decried the pandemic. He said that people should not wear masks. He prescribed a drug called chloroquine to the population without any scientific basis. And to this date, he continues to vulgarize death because, effectively, he does not believe in science, nor in the Brazilian people, and he does not respect individuals. The only thing he does is compliment Trump and to try to copy the same foolish things that Trump does in the US.
Well, we invite Brazil's ambassador to London on the show. Presumably President Bolsonaro would dispute what you're saying, and in fairness, Brazil's death rate per capita is less than that here in Britain. You do presumably, though, agree with Bolsonaro that Cuban doctors should have been let back into Brazil. You, of course, knew Fidel Castro and no Diaz-Canel.
The Cuban doctors provided an extraordinary service in Brazil. They assisted 60 million people, and they were excellent examples of how doctors should conduct their work. They did not only prescribe drugs and make diagnostics, they tried to do more than that. They treated people with love, with care. They were going to people's homes. The fact that the Brazilian government sent the Cuban doctors away and that President Raul Castro decided to call doctors back is because he does not agree with the fascist who ruled Brazil. I know that the Cuban doctors could have helped many countries around the world because Cuba has many more doctors proportionally to its population than any other country in the world. I am very proud of belonging to the political party that brought doctors from Cuba to save lives in Brazil and to care for the poor population in the peripheries around our country.
Now, of course, it could have been you that was president presiding over the coronavirus in Brazil. It's a long story, but very briefly, why is it Bolsonaro who is president and not Lula who is in power there?
As you know, Afshan, in Brazil, some important things took place that the world needs to know about. For the first time in its history during my government, Brazil became an international player. Brazil had created UNASUL, demonstrating a beautiful relationship within South America. Brazil had developed a relationship between South America and Africa. between South America and the Arab countries. Brazil had taken part in the creation of the BRICS. Brazil had created IBUS. That is, Brazil was becoming an international player, and that is something that the Americans never allowed. Now Brazil is returning to the colonial period. After the coup on President Dilma, they would never want to have Lula back as the president of the republic, to continue our domestic social inclusion policy and our international protagonism policy. They want Brazil to continue to be a colony. So they conjured this lie called the car wash operation against me. They invented a lie during the procedure. They condemned me without any evidence. I proved my innocence, and I am waiting for them to prove any guilt on my part. I have challenged the federal prosecutor and the judge who headed my trial. But I am much more concerned with Brazil at this moment. We had eliminated hunger in Brazil, and hunger has returned. We were in a process of raising education in this country, and now we have a great setback in education, as well as in science and technology. We have major setbacks in the environmental legislation, in deforestation, and in the preservation of our forests and our water sources. Obviously, Brazil would be better off if I had been allowed to be a candidate. They withdrew my candidacy for president with a legal procedure because they knew that if I ran in the elections, I would have won in the first round. And here in Brazil, a part of the country's elite cannot stand to see poor people eating in restaurants, or traveling by plane, or buying cars. They cannot stand to see poor people ascending, which is what we did through hundreds of public policies to improve the lives of the poor people in this country. I am proud that the President of the United Nations acknowledged that Brazil had eliminated hunger. I am proud that in 2010, Brazil was the country with the highest level of hope in the world, with the happiest people in the world, because we had so many expectations, so many dreams, and Brazil was about to become the fifth global economy. Now we see Brazil experiencing a rise in poverty. People are hungry in Sao Paulo, in Rio de Janeiro, and all over the country. People have gone back to the streets. Wages dropped drastically and unemployment has risen. This is the country of the fascists who rule it. I want a democratic country, a sovereign country, a country where people are happy and proud to say that they are Brazilian.
There's no doubt that you brought tens of millions of people out of poverty and into education. But when you were in that jail cell, did you not regret leaving those very elites in power in your 2 terms as president and Dilma Rousseff, leaving them in power to prosecute you both? Was that your greatest mistake?
I won an election. I did not start a revolution. I do not believe that a metalworker like myself could have become president of the Republic if it had not been for democracy, and if it had not been, most of all, for democracy and for the Brazilian people's comprehension and maturity when they voted. I confess that I ruled for all. I doubt that there was any moment in Brazilian history when everyone benefited so much. It is true that businesses won. It is true that bankers won. It is true that big landowners won. But it is also true that the poor workers won too. We had the greatest wage rise for the poor people during my government, the greatest rise in education. We are already known in history as the government that built the greatest number of universities and technical schools, that invested the most in science and technology. And for sure, we must have made mistakes, or else there would have been no coup against President Dilma. The coup was the beginning of a new attitude in Brazil. In my opinion, it was organized by the US Department of Justice. with the participation of the CIA. We have video recordings. The Intercept has publicly exposed all the scams of the federal prosecutor and Judge Moro, and the participation of the US DOJ in destroying the construction and engineering segment in Brazil, the gas industry in Brazil, and the country's politics. Because the US never accepted the fact that Brazil would become an international player. You must remember that the US and Europe had a hard time dealing with Iran because they could not reach an agreement with regards to uranium enrichment. Ambassador Celso Amorim and I went to Iran with the President of Turkey, and we were successful in convincing Iran to accept an agreement which was better than this deal that was signed by the Americans and the European Union. Regretfully, when we proposed the agreement, I expected that the US and Europe would thank Brazil and Turkey. Instead, they applied more sanctions against Iran in a clear demonstration that they were telling us that Brazil is a small third world country that cannot meddle with major countries' affairs.
Well, the right wing, the PDMD, said it's worth destroying Brazilian companies if it roots out corruption. You mentioned Sergio Moro, the Justice Minister of Bolsonaro, as well as being your prosecutor, who was then fired. Do you think he will run for president in 2022? And what sort of president will he be?
Ashton, one thing I pray to God every day I am sure that Moro and Dallagnol must take very heavy drugs to sleep because their conscience is not calm. They know that they lied about me. Dallagnol knows that he formed a gang in the car wash task force to pass on information to the US and to strike a deal, a financial deal even, through which Dallagnol would raise a 2 million real fund to do something here in Brazil. My conscience is calm because my innocence is proven. Now I want to prove their guilt in the crimes they committed against Brazil, attempting to destroy Brazil's sovereignty. Today, I do not feel any hatred or resentment. I am actually destined to continue fighting for democracy because, as you know, although I will be 75 years old on October the 27th, I have the energy of a 30-year-old and the political will of a 20-year-old. Therefore, I still have a lot of energy to fight for democracy and for the Brazilian people, and also to try to contribute to a world with new leaders that are more impetuous and brave for politics. Because world governance nowadays has been outsourced. Crises are no longer managed by governments, but rather by bureaucrats. So there are no more political leaders, and this weakens politics and originates people of the likes of Trump and Bolsonaro.
I know you're not going to announce on Going Underground that you're running for the presidency in 2022. Former president, I'll stop you there. More from the former president of Brazil, credited with lifting millions out of poverty after this short break. Welcome back. I'm still here with the 35th president of Brazil, Lula. I do want to ask you something about another element to the car wash saga. Even Donald Trump talks about the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower mentioned. Do you believe that the nuclear submarine hull contract alerted the United States military-industrial complex, used car wash, and that ended up in the destruction of the PT government in Brazil?
I am certain that the Americans did not agree that we should settle an agreement with France to build the nuclear submarine. I am certain that they did not appreciate it when I created the South American Defense Secretariat. Because as soon as we discovered the pre-salt oil, which was the major oil discovery of the 21st century, 100,000 meters deep in the Atlantic Ocean, the Americans announced that they would reactivate their fourth maritime fleet in the Atlantic Ocean, which had ceased to operate after World War II. Our oil is on the maritime border of our international waters. So I believe that the US truly are interested in taking over our oil. Just as they grab so much oil in so many countries around the world. As you know, Afshan, all political confusions around the world occur because of oil, and the Americans do not want Petrobras, nor the Brazilian people, to keep all that oil.
Obviously, Washington denies that, but then how innocent were you and Dilma Rousseff? You know about Edward Snowden in Moscow, who says there are wiretaps on phone calls that lead to the NSA, to the US security state. You knew Hugo Chavez. He told you about the coup in Venezuela. How innocent were you when Dilma Rousseff was in power that they weren't going to get you?
As you know, Afshan, I had a fantastic relationship with President Chavez for many years. And I created a group of friends of Venezuela to prevent any American intervention. And we were very successful during the Bush administration and later in the Obama administration with the following phrase: the people of Venezuela take care of democracy in Venezuela. An American citizen who wins elections based on fake news, like Trump, has no moral authority to talk about democracy. Likewise, Bolsonaro in Brazil. Certainly, I may have been naive, as well as Dilma, in believing in democracy, in believing in the conduct of the Brazilian elite, and we are paying the price for that. But, nevertheless, I think that the solution is a democratic one. It involves democracy, freedom of the press, freedom of labor unions, freedom of association, respect to human rights. This is what motivates me, and this is what I will fight for. Because it is only with democracy that we will be able to improve the quality of life of the poor, of the workers, and of the excluded people in our country. It is true that the Americans may hate Snowden because he was a State Department employee and he leaked information. But the fact is that Assange should be considered a hero by all democratic countries around the world. Because he was the one who used Snowden's leaks to expose US espionage in Petrobras, in Brazil, in Germany, in Argentina, in France. That is, Assange cannot be handed over to the US. Assange should win the Nobel Peace Prize because he managed to expose the rotten espionage of the US in the rest of the world. It is a pity that European and South American countries are not brave enough to stand up for Assange, for all the good he did to mankind.
Well, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture said on this programme that Julian Assange is being tortured by UK authorities. His controversial extradition trial is taking place here in London, but the UN claims that the media smeared him. You mentioned Hugo Chavez. I understand Venezuela's leader once asked you to support Telesur television when he created it, and you said you wouldn't and you didn't know why. After 2 terms as president, why did you do nothing to reform oligarch-owned media in Brazil?
I didn't do anything because in Brazil, to change the rules for the media, you need to submit a bill to be voted in the National Congress. And the majority in Congress, being so conservative, will never approve the rules to make the media more democratic. We created a public TV channel. Certainly, we did not make the necessary investments to make it competitive, not financially competitive, but competitive with regards to providing more information to society. This is something I regret not having done. We developed a project to regulate the media. It was complete by mid-2009. We did not have support from Congress because elections would be held the following year, and we left it for the new administration. This is one thing that we will need to do when the PT returns to the government, because information that is meant for society cannot have an owner. Information cannot be conveyed to society from the viewpoint of the economy or of a part of that society.
But of course, you will depend on that media. The PT party, with the flag behind you there, will depend on that oligarch-owned media to give a fair representation before Brazilians go to the polls in 2022. I've got to ask about the rainforests because of the implications of coronavirus, of global warming. What do you think will happen to them if Bolsonaro or if Moro becomes president in 2022?
Moro will never become president. Moro was fabricated by Globo TV. Moro is an invention of the media. And without the media, he is nothing. Moro is a citizen who, I believe, seems to be a coward, because I have challenged him to debate with me. Now that he is no longer a judge, he could debate with me, but he won't. And I do not think Globo will have the guts to support him. But if he is, it is not a problem at all. The Amazon must remain a problem for the Brazilian society. The Amazon does not need to have squatters or invaders. Instead of cattle breeders and soybean farmers, the Amazon needs to be occupied by researchers, anthropologists and scientists to study its plants and animals and all the pharmacological wealth it has, as well as its potential to feed our society. The Amazon is extraordinary for mankind, and Brazil needs to have the obligation, the moral and ethical commitment to preserve the Amazon in order to provide balance to planet Earth. This is an irresponsibility of the Bolsonaro government, which has destroyed the entire surveillance system. Even the director of the agency that monitored deforestation with spatial imaging was dismissed. Now they are blaming the indigenous people and the small farmers for deforestation. I have high hopes that in 2022, Brazil will return to democracy, that the people will elect a Democrat for president who respects the environment and our airspace, our borders, and who knows the meaning of our country's sovereignty.
Finally, when Maduro won in Venezuela, the European Union, just like Washington, refused to accept him as president of Venezuela. They opted for Juan Guaido. The CIA readily admits to its history of attempts on the lives of leaders in the global south. Bolsonaro was the first Brazilian leader to actually visit the CIA's headquarters in Langley. How sure are you that there won't be attempts on your life if the PT wins in 2022?
I have no certainty, but that will not keep me from doing anything. I am convinced that the only solution we have is to strengthen democracy, including the American people now, with the elections. They have the right to change American politics by electing someone who is civilized, someone who has some humanity, someone who has at least some respect for blacks, for Native Americans, for the women, and for differences between human beings. Therefore, we have the duty to rebuild democracy in the world so that we can prevent the destruction of planet Earth, which is like a boat, and we are all sinking in it. I think we need to realize that the Americans are going backwards in exercising democracy. Recently, I saw Trump calling Obama a communist, calling Biden a communist, calling Clinton a communist. He doesn't even know what communism is. That is, I think ignorance is defeating intelligence. And it is not possible that intelligence, humanism, solidarity need to be restored in the world. The world today is being ruled by committees, not by governments. I think the governments need to recover their role in governance, including the United Nations. The UN needs to change its role. Today's UN cannot be the same as it was in 1948. We need to have African countries in the UN Security Council. We need Latin American countries in the Security Council, and countries like India. It cannot be the same 5 countries as in 1948. We need to create a new global governance. In 1948, the UN was strong enough to create the State of Israel. In 2020, the UN does not have the power to create the Palestinian state. It is shameful because we need to rediscuss the role of the UN and other institutions. We need to discuss the IMF. What is the use of the IMF? What is the use of the World Bank? I have already talked to Pope Francis. I have gone to the World Council of Churches in Geneva. We need a global campaign against inequality on our planet. It is not possible that half a dozen entrepreneurs in digital corporations make in 1 year what billions of human beings do not ever have. We also need to discuss the role of capitalism. And I am willing to do this.
Lula da Silva, thank you. That's it for the show. We'll be back on Monday to speak to a controversial economist, Columbia University's Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Until then, stay safe and join the Underground on YouTube, Twitter, SoundCloud, Instagram and Facebook.